This episode is sponsored by Wix Studio.
When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back. This is the HTML All the Things Podcast. This episode is titled, working title. Well, actually, that's not the title. The title is not working title. This title is potentially a working title. Tech we love as web developers, SvelteKit, Webflow, Vercel, Supermaven. In this episode, Can't Talk, we are going to be discussing about everything about the tech we love. This is going to go into the software, of course, like I already mentioned, which is the development tools that we use. Most of it, if not all of it, is software, but we're also going to touch on some of the hardware that we like using. Now, we've had an episode in the past where it was kind of like a gear guide where we talked about this is what we buy, this is what we use, this is what we recommend you purchase, whatever that episode touched on. It touched on all things hardware. This week, we're just going to be talking about sort of like, I don't know, I guess being a fan of different things. Like, I like this microphone, I like this desk, or whatever it is. So we're going to be talking about the hardware side a little bit as well. And I mean, that's basically it. It's going to be a nice positive episode talking about all kinds of different things like SvelteKit, Tailwind CSS, a whole bunch of other different things. So if this sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go and check us out on that Patreon, leave a review or rating on your podcast app, join us in our Discord server, or share this with your friends. So Mike, you are actually the one that wrote this episode, so why don't you take it away?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this episode kind of came to be because I'm using a lot of really awesome tech that I really like, and there's a little bit of a negativity in the web development space because of the amount of technology out there. And I want to kind of bring it back in because, yes, stuff like Laravel makes it easy to build a web application with one stack without having to reach for a million different things. I get that. Really cool piece of tech. Love Laravel. But there's a reason why these kind of fragmented ecosystems exist, where you kind of choose the best thing for the job and then put it all together into one stack, right? And it does, in certain situations, increase developer experience, and you can make something that kind of is almost kind of a little bit magical. This is a little, anecdotal fluff piece, whatever you want to call it. But like, I've been using a particular set of web development frameworks and libraries that I really like, and I just want to talk about them. And I want to say why, I want to say what they are, and I want to tell you why I like them, because maybe then you can try them out and see if you can fit them into your workflow, fit them into your stack as well. You know, you don't have to, obviously, to be successful. You can use anything in the web development space, including stuff like WordPress, which kind of does everything for you, including stuff like Laravel, which is mostly all built in. But that's not to say that these fragmented, put together stacks are a bad thing either, because it's easier to innovate in smaller doses, in my opinion. So instead of having to innovate across a full, established framework, you innovate on just like the styling, how you manage styling. And then that thing can be integrated into any framework. I don't know, I have a soft spot for that kind of web development. And I think it's going to go away at some point. That's another kind of key piece to this, is I don't think this is going to be maintainable because of the chaotic learning experience that it brings to the ecosystem. And obviously there's already been quite a bit of pushback. If you look at X, or what formerly was Twitter, there's a bunch of people talking about how it's impossible to learn web development because of this fragmentation, et cetera, et cetera. And they have a point, which is why I think, there is some argument to be said that we're eventually going to standardize on something. Having said that, let's dive right into the web development tech. So the first thing here, and the thing that I probably talk about the most on this podcast, is Svelte or SvelteKit. So what is Svelte? It is a modern JavaScript framework. It compiles components at build time, resulting in a very, very highly efficient, minimalistic web application. So it just compiles down to like exactly what you need. It compiles away the framework itself, so all you're left with is essentially just the JavaScript, HTML, and CSS that you need to run a web page. It's a big difference from other frameworks like the traditional React framework or Angular or Vue, where instead of compiling, it actually bundles the framework with them, and the framework acts as the thing that actually handles the reactivity in the browser itself. So you're bundling a bunch of code that will make your app interactive versus taking the code that you write, compiling it, removing all of the framework code, and just making it so that it's just like a bunch of JavaScript, like standard, like regular JavaScript that will, mimic what you needed it to do in the development environment. SvelteKit itself, also just to expand on that, is the meta framework for Svelte. And I just want to kind of touch on what meta framework means, because I feel like this is lost a lot of times in explanations. A meta framework is something that like builds on top of an existing framework and it gives the framework more capabilities on top of its base structure. So Svelte is the regular framework. SvelteKit is the meta framework on top of Svelte that gives it stuff like routing, that gives it server-side rendering capabilities, incremental server rendering capabilities. It gives it server-side API capabilities. So it essentially adds a server component to a Svelte application so that you can do everything, including backend and front end, all in one code base, and really kind of in a somewhat opinionated way, making it a little bit easier to bundle your entire code into one repository rather than having to deal with, a separate front end, a separate back end, and then mashing them together in some sort of middleware API layer. SvelteKit handles that for you.
May I ask, like, with something like this, why would you not just upgrade or update Svelte to include SvelteKit by default? Because I know that a lot of people will use just like SvelteKit, which includes Svelte. Like, let's use them in tandem, together, whatever, cooperatively, however you want to say it. Like, it is possible to just use Svelte. It is possible just to download Svelte and not use sort of like that more server-side stuff from SvelteKit. But in many other softwares out there, and maybe this is the answer, because this is, Svelte/SvelteKit is certainly a software, but it's definitely a development tool. But a lot of softwares out there as a complete offering, like when they upgrade or update, they will commonly include all the features, right? Like they'll just say, okay, like, here's Svelte, and then here's like Svelte 2.0, from a marketing perspective. And, Svelte 2.0 has Svelte and SvelteKit in there to it allows you to, it wouldn't even be a mention of SvelteKit. It would just literally be theoretical Svelte 2.0 would have server-side rendering, routing, all that stuff. Like, why do you think that this is the case as to why there's that piece of fragmentation? Because you already mentioned sort of some of the chaotic, I guess, really fragmentation that exists, and you think that like it's going to start kind of slowly going away when it comes to developing on the web. Why is there a seam here at all? Is, I guess, really my question. Like, it just feels like you should just meld it together and call it a day.
No, it's a very good question, and it's actually a very good indicator on the fact that fragmentation is slowly starting to go away. For instance, if you go on the Svelte docs and look at their getting started guide, it recommends you to get started with SvelteKit. So even the regular Svelte docs will immediately take you to SvelteKit. And it's, in fact, I think it's the same for React, where in the React docs, instead of getting you to build React regularly in like the Create React app and just have React, it'll take you to Next.js and be like, this is our recommended way of using React. So they're already starting to shift the mentality of, hey, let's stop being as fragmented. Let's give you access to all of these features when you're learning so that it makes it easier for you to kind of go on. Now, why they're still separate, it's a very good point, because it removes the lock from it being SvelteKit being the only way to use Svelte. The other ways you can use Svelte is you can just use bare Svelte, and you'd have to adapt it a little bit to be able to deploy it, right? Like, it's not as simple as SvelteKit to deploy a Svelte app. There's a little bit more to it. That's what SvelteKit kind of helps with, but there are other options to use Svelte inside of a meta framework. There's a framework called Astro, for example, that allows you to use almost any framework inside of it. And Astro is a way you can actually use Svelte components. And so that's an alternative to SvelteKit. And that's the reason why it's the main reason why it's separate, is that so you have many different options, and so that this innovation can continue. Because if they were to just create SvelteKit and bundle that really closely together, then the innovation of Svelte itself would stop from the external perspective. And they don't want that. They want the ability for people to be able to take Svelte and use it in whatever new meta framework they create, if that option is available, so that, again, something can be standardized, but something can still be innovated. It's still in this kind of figuring out mode. That's why it's like, it's not imminent where, next year we're going to have this like opinionated framework all of a sudden that combines all the stuff that we're going to talk about. That's not going to happen next year. I think we're 5 to 10 years away from that. But you're starting to see the cracks where, like I said, in the documentation, it's pointing you to a meta framework that has more encompassing features in it.
It's sort of like, if you take it out of this context, it's sort of like how like email itself is like really like standardized at this point. And then you just quite literally just have like email clients. And that's kind of always how email has been, or it's been like this for a very long time, but just got kind of a basic example, because all these companies are not going to just suddenly become React, right? Like there's not going to be like one person that just buys all these things together. However, whatever companies, whatever softwares survive will probably have those sort of tentacles out, attaching themselves to other things. So like Astro, like you were saying, how you could use a Svelte component. I think you can use React component maybe even in there as well. Things like that. Like I feel like any company that's like sort of survives these changes are still going to have those fragmentations, but you're going to have like mature connections, right? Like mature connections to Svelte. So there's going to be less bugs. The Svelte itself will become more secure, more mature rather at that point. And so at that point, like you have a more mature sort of way to do things. Like how often do you, realistically speaking, short of like some UX problems, how often do you have email problems these days, right? It's like not that often, realistically speaking, because it's a mature piece of technology. And even if you use like the Microsoft ecosystem for delivering your mail, if you don't like that, you could go to Thunderbird and sign in, and you can rely on it to actually, sync your emails, be allowed to send email, receive email, things like that. So like, it's kind of like that, right? It's kind of like that same feeling where it's like you can rely on going somewhere else, and as long as those connections exist, you could still use like what you're familiar with or what you have to for work.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, this is a little bit of a tangent, but the email discussion is kind of a big one, because this, in my opinion, the email consolidation is actually an example of a bad situation where we went from a very open, fragmented ecosystem of email providers, right? Because email is an open standard, like anyone can adopt it. You can have it in multiple different ways. But the problem is that because everyone started to consolidate between Microsoft and Gmail, or Microsoft and Google, it became this thing where they started to develop these whitelists. And then all of a sudden you're in this situation where you don't have fragmentation. You can't start your own email provider, because if you're not part of this Microsoft or Google whitelist, then all of a sudden your scores start to go down for email, and the main clients, Gmail and Microsoft, regardless of what we think, those are the things that people are using, will stop accepting your emails. And so they kind of control the entire email ecosystem right now because of their ability to filter out emails and their ability to claim the market share. And that really makes it difficult for anyone to, like, not an email application, but anyone to start an email provider service, right? Like webmail, for instance, has become much, much harder to maintain because webmail isn't part of Google or Microsoft. So therefore, it can be easily blocked, and then you're screwed and you won't know about it, right? Like this is where it becomes really complicated. Whereas if you sign up for something like Microsoft or Google email, they take care of all that for you. They tell you if your reputation is going down, and they tell you how to fix it, and et cetera, et cetera. And they try to make sure that the reputation of your email stays high enough for you to be able to send out and other people to receive your emails, because they can do that.
There is still like some entrance, but it is definitely like a little bit at the mercy. Like, I mean, we've experienced this firsthand, where if you're using shared hosting, you will commonly be given sort of access to webmail, which is customized email, right? Like, I mean, it depends on what features your host offers, but just in general, at a low level, it's just basically, or high level, it's just basically, if you have a domain, like, I don't know, matt.com or something like that, and you wanted to host a website, you can. And then if they offer webmail, you can have emails that are like, me@matt.com or whatever. The problem is that especially if you're on a shared server, a lot of the time, the sort of like server that you're sending mail out of is shared, like I said, with other random clients that you don't know. And if they use it for spam, then your emails can start bouncing. You start having problems. Now, there are ways to get back in, good graces. You can contact your host. In my experience, you contact the host. Then the host contacts, they have like some sort of contact or portal or whatever to, tell Microsoft, to tell Google, hey, take us off of the block, put us back onto the, allow list effectively, because we want to be able to still send emails. So, I mean, some of our clients are on webmail, effectively we're an email provider, I guess you could say at that point. It's definitely a side service, but it is at a point where, these clients are getting blocked for like here and there. We've been blocked by, someone sending too many emails, someone sending spam, things like that. It's gotten better and better, and like those blocks are less and less, but it's a problem because, there are people out there that really rely on email, and all of a sudden, like, they're just talking with a client, and then all of a sudden they just can't talk to them anymore. And so then I'm like, they contact me, I have to get logs, then I have to send those logs to the provider. The provider goes and like makes sure, puts in the application. It takes 1 or 2 days for the application to go through, and there's nothing that's going to necessarily prevent this problem from happening again next week. So we often will tell clients, hey, like, we recommend that we hook up, Microsoft 365 for you, or we hook up, Gmail for you. Like, I guess it's Google Apps for Work, I guess is what it's called, one of their email services, because then they deal with everything. And the only thing we got to do is more or less, we got to put up a few DNS records, and Microsoft and Google will just tell you what DNS records to set up. So it's just more or less fill in the blank. That does kind of suck. But I mean, at some point though, like, I do understand it, because there are so many people online, because there's so many email addresses, because there are so many email addresses in so many demographics. It makes a ton of sense that people are going to log into email accounts or make new email accounts and spam out cold emails, right? 200 an hour, 200 an hour, automated, whether it's like scam or spam, like just, they're just spamming, but it's not actually a scam, or whether they're just emailing way too much. It will like overrun, a lot of people's systems, and, spam filters can only do so much. So I get it that it kind of sucks that, sort of the big boys are kind of in charge of the space. However, it's like, I get enough dang, like, email that's useless to appreciate the fact that there is something actually holding back a little bit of it, because again, like, I get so much of it anyway. So it's kind of a catch-22. I'm kind of on the fence. It's like, would it, in a utopian world, would it be cool if everyone could just, have email and just spin up an email service really quickly and really easily, without using the backbone of one of the big boys? Absolutely, that'd be great. Unfortunately, though, because there's a lot of bad actors out there, because there's a lot of people that are just spamming, unfortunately, that's just not going to happen, right? And so I appreciate sort of the spam filter, I guess, is what effectively it is, right? It's kind of like a spam filter before the spam filter, where it's just not allowing the email to come in at all. So I'm a little bit on the fence on it in that particular case.
And I get it. Like, it's always going to be a give and take in these situations where sometimes they do provide a huge service, and they are at this point. It's just, yeah, like you said, a utopia. But to get back into the episode, Svelte and SvelteKit, why do I use it? Why is it on this list? In my opinion, it's just a very well-designed framework for handling interactivity on the web. I've used React, I've used Vue. They're both fine and they're both good. But when I used Svelte, it started to make sense. Like, I started to understand the deep connections to the actual front end. Because it compiles down to regular JavaScript, it's a little bit easier for me to go in and look at the compiled code and make sense of it, to be understanding what my very simple, like, React or Svelte code is doing. And then it compiles down to, fairly more complex JavaScript code. But I can go through that compiled code and start to understand. And that gave me more insight into how the framework works. That gave me more insight into how frameworks work in general, which I really appreciated. And from then on, I kind of just dove deeper and deeper into SvelteKit, and I haven't looked back. I'm sure there's other, caveats with other frameworks, and I'm sure that I could do the same thing with other frameworks that I do with Svelte. But the fact that it's just provided a very frictionless way for me to spin up in a pretty complex ecosystem, where, like, especially with adding SvelteKit on top of it and being able to run these full stack applications, backend and front end, with these spliced together backend and front end servers that are easily deployable on services like Vercel, and I'll talk about Vercel in a second because I still am a pretty big fan of it. But yeah, it's one of those things where this is just working for me. New Svelte 5 is just around the corner. It is going to change a lot of things, but everything that I've kind of looked at, everything that I've experienced with Svelte 5 in my limited time using it and reading about it has made it even more performant and better. And the other thing I really like about Svelte is it's fairly forgiving. So if I write shitty code, which I'm prone to do, it's still going to perform very well because of how minimalistic the framework actually is. So I'm able to write shittier code and have it perform better than the code that I would write in like a Next.js or, a Vue application, which is nice. Like, yeah, I'm not going to say that I'm a 10x programmer. I'm not like some giga-brain genius. So I'm not going to be writing the most efficient code all the time. Sometimes I just need to get a feature out. And the fact that I can jank together some code and it still runs at lightning speed is a useful plus, in my opinion. It's not the ideal thing. You obviously want to write good code no matter what, but it's nice to be a little more forgiving. With that, let's move on to the next one here, which is Tailwind CSS. So this one, polarizing, not polarizing, I don't know. I don't really care. A Tailwind is a utility-first CSS framework. It allows you to build responsive and customizable designs in your HTML. It has an opinionated style guide that's in it. So like the spacing, fonts, everything. The defaults that are set out are very opinionated, and they're really nice and easy to work with. The colors, the color gradients are really good to work with. Like when you first install Tailwind, your application already gets a boost from just the standardization of things. So like when you put a font large, it'll always be the same size on everything. When you put a text black, it'll be the same black. When you start writing a regular paragraph, that paragraph will be styled, have the same spacing all across the board. And it's kind of like opinionated spacing that's been vetted by thousands and thousands of developers, so you know it's going to look decent. It's not opinionated in the sense that they're locking you into a border radius on a button, or they're locking you into a color for buttons. Those are all customizable. It's opinionated from the higher level of like what the different size elements, so like the different size between the small text and a large text, those are set for you. You can change them. You can change the opinionated structure, but for someone that doesn't care about the style as much, because I'm more of a developer, not a UX guy, it's easier for me to get started with something that's already been vetted, already opinionated. So I went down that route because I think it's an important part of Tailwind that people don't talk about as often. People just talk about, hey, it's just a utility CSS framework where you can write your, CSS in line with your HTML. That's really the selling point of Tailwind, but it does come with this opinionated design system that's actually pretty awesome and easy to work with. So it has both those things. They balance each other out. Learning Tailwind is a little bit easier for me than learning something like Bootstrap was, because Tailwind correlates directly to CSS classes. So knowing CSS greatly increases your ability to learn Tailwind. And vice versa, even like if you learn Tailwind, it'll probably be easier for you to take that knowledge and apply it to CSS as well. Whereas a more structured framework, like, a style framework like Bootstrap, the classes that they provide are very Bootstrap centric. So they're not really correlated directly to like a CSS style. They're correlated to like, this is how we're going to make a button look. And you just put a button class and the button all of a sudden changes completely, right? Like with a bunch of different style elements. Whereas Tailwind, like you have to signal every single element or every single style you want changed inside the style tag or the class tag of a HTML element. And therefore it correlates one-to-one pretty much to a style in the CSS. It's just easier to pick up.
I was going to say that one of the things with Tailwind CSS, it's been a long, long time since I've used it, but it felt very much just like using CSS right in the HTML. Now, again, it kind of sounds like it's been updated, since then, or it has been updated since then to be a little bit more Bootstrap-like, definitely like it's got more opinions, it's got more of this, it's got more of that in there. When I was using it, what the number one sort of UX thing that I liked was, this is a number of years ago, so I'm kind of dating myself. I think I was coding in just Notepad++, and quite literally just it saved me from having to switch, to this document back to the styles, like HTML document to the CSS, back and forth, back and forth. It saved me from doing that. It was just like I was able to just quickly spin up some UI elements. Like I was just playing with it more or less. I was just sort of making sort of a standard blog layout. It wasn't adding any sort of CMS or anything like that. But it was, allowed me to very quickly do that. I will say in one way that I don't disagree with some people's opinion where, hey, the CSS is getting pretty chunky and not necessarily in file size. I know that is a complaint, but, text is very small. So I'm not super worried about that. It's more of like an organizational thing where I feel like some people are just like vehemently against having HTML be, let's say, polluted with CSS. Like, obviously, you can do inline styles, but it's sort of like some people want to organizationally be like, If I'm using an inline style, I'm using an inline style for a reason, because I need an inline style. And if I want to style things otherwise, I want my CSS in a CSS file, and then I want to use IDs and classes in order to, kind of cut down on what's like. Styles are in the style sheet, HTML is for my structure, and I only connect them with those IDs and those classes and inline styles effectively when I have to and when I need to, or when there's a utilitarian reason to do so. And I get that too. I don't think any particular way is, necessarily incorrect. Maybe that's just me, but that's my opinion on that.
No, you're 100% right. Both ways are very valid, and the criticisms are very valid as well. I'm a fan of co-location of concerns, which means I like it when one file contains everything needed for that file to run, including the JavaScript, the CSS, and the HTML. So as close as I can combine them, like some, frameworks like Svelte allow you to write styles, a style tag inside the file, allow you to write the script tag inside the file and the HTML inside the file. That's one, co-location. But even closer to that is being able to write the style inside the HTML. And that's what I really like, not having to go between, the style tag and the HTML, having it understandable from first read without having to be like, okay, well, what does divider actually mean? And then having to scroll to the styling and then see what divider means and then have to scroll back, or having open them side by side. Like, it's a 100% a preference thing, but I do think it makes me faster, right? If you can do it in a maintainable, sustainable way where the code doesn't become extraordinarily complex, because you could take this to the next level and write all your JavaScript inside your HTML too. That is maybe too much for me, right? Like, you do need some separation, that there's no doubt about that. But I think Tailwind allows you to do it in an organized, readable way, as long as you can get past that. Your HTML is going to look shittier. 100%. Like, no matter what you think, the HTML is going to look messy, because you have some styles that can go really, really long. And there's nothing you can do about that other than using something called an add apply tag in Tailwind. But I'm very against apply tags from a design perspective, because I think it takes the whole reasoning to use Tailwind away. I think why you use Tailwind is so that you can go in and, again, keep your code, keep your styles inside your HTML. And also, if I go into Jim's HTML, I can read his HTML right away with all of his styles in it, the same way I could read mine without having to go in and understand what his, BEM style is, or what his, style naming guide is, or where he codes his styles. Like, all of that is extra stuff that I don't want to deal with. I just want to go into his HTML, look at his HTML, and be able to know exactly what it's doing, edit it, and stuff like that. That's the advantage that I see with Tailwind over everything else. And it did initially take me a while to wrap my head around that. And I can understand the hesitation for some people. I can 100% understand it. I think the next thing here, it kind of builds on Tailwind, is called ChatCN. So this is a really, really popular UI library. So this is something that something was way more opinionated, but it is something that's very customizable. And I'll explain. So a traditional UI library, like, for instance, let's take Bootstrap, has a bunch of components available to you that you can use out of the box. But what it does is that you just kind of install Bootstrap, or you use it from a package, like from a script tag import. And then you just use the HTML tag that correlates to whatever style you're going to import from Bootstrap, right? It's all kind of away from you, extrapolated inside of an NPN package, or on a server like a CDN or something like that. You're not really able to directly go into the file of that button that Bootstrap provides and edit that button. What you have to do is you kind of have to pass in parameters into that button and have that edited. And to a certain degree, that's really good, because it's really opinionated. It makes it so that the buttons are all the same. But from another perspective, if you want to go in and actually edit that button to do more than what it is doing, like maybe you want that button to also be a tag if it detects a script or like a source, right? Like if you pass in a source into a button, maybe you want to automatically switch from button to href, right? That becomes more difficult, right? Now, then you're writing logic code to switch between a button and an a tag. Whereas if you just have access to the actual HTML and code of that button, you could go in and edit it. And ChatCN allows you to do that. Instead of being an NPN package, you're actually importing the code directly into your files. It's all accessible to you. It's all editable for you. And it also makes it kind of easy to update as well. Even if you were to edit some stuff, there's a CLI tool that allows you to kind of migrate to a newer version. But the reality is that ShadCN's pretty stable. It hardly ever requires you to like update their button component because it's just a simple button that's really accessible. Like it has a very high accessibility factor where like all of the ARIA tags are filled out correctly based on the context of the button. The tab index groups are all set well. It has a very high emphasis on accessibility that you don't have to kind of custom code yourself. And it allows you to do more complex things like a custom drop-down menu, custom checkboxes. Like it adds all the form fields that you would have to write custom, adds all the accessibility functions on top of them in a more like headless way as well, and gives you the styling, an initial style for you to kind of play around with and edit as much as you want. So it's just a more customizable and easier to maintain, in my opinion, UI library versus a very opinionated, locked down UI library that extrapolates all that into a package. And as far as I understand it now, I believe ShadCN is available for React, Vue, and Svelte at this point. So you can use it across all the big frameworks. Next thing here is TRPC. So this one is a kind of a newer one that I've started using. And it is a super powerful TypeScript library that allows you to create fully typed APIs without needing to write like boilerplate code that passes the types in. So it essentially lets you define an API, define the API on the server, and what it does is it passes that API, all the types, specifically the types, to your client application. So because stuff like meta frameworks exist, I explained what meta frameworks are earlier in the episode, it combines the client and the server. A big challenge of those frameworks a lot of times is passing types from the server-side code to the client-side code in an efficient way. So when you write, for instance, a fetch call on the server that will go and fetch an API and return a certain data, like a dog, for instance. It goes and fetches a dog. You write that all on the server, and then you type it on the server being like, okay, I want this dog to have, how many legs does it have? Obviously 4, but whatever. What's its name? What's its age? And all that. When you go and try to query that dog and pass it onto the client, traditionally, the client actually has no idea what the server is passing it. So you have to type it again or import a type on the client to know that, hey, this dog is supposed to have a name, age, and amount of legs, right? So it kind of increases the cognitive burden of having to maintain the types between your client and your server. It makes it harder for you to know where that actual call is coming from, like the API call is coming from, because a lot of times without TRPC, what happens is you're actually using something like a fetch inside of your client to query your backend, right? And that fetch has no idea where it's coming from. So you have to go and find that file wherever that fetch, like, the route of the fetch is going /API/ whatever, and then go and look at that file. Whereas TRPC, what it allows you to do is actually import the entire route as a fully typed JavaScript function to your front end. And you can actually command click or control click on it, and it'll take you right to the file, the backend file, where you wrote that backend function. So it just provides a super good developer experience as well as a really good TypeScript experience from backend to front end, specifically for meta frameworks. And I believe, I'm not sure if this works with Vue. It definitely works with Svelte because we're using it in Svelte. It works with React. That's what it was built for. And yeah, it's another way to organize APIs. Really, if it comes down to it, that's really how I explain it a lot of times to people just starting out. Being able to put APIs into separate files, making it easier for people to understand where those APIs that you're writing are, and then being able to only write types in one location and have it all propagate between the front end and back end. Those are the three main things.
Honestly, sounds like something that should be added to TypeScript at this point, almost in a way.
It would be cool. Yeah, it would be cool if it was added in some sort of native way to frameworks in general. Like I feel like just like Next.js or SvelteKit can adopt something like TRPC. They kind of have, like, to be fair, SvelteKit has a little bit of this type safe report. What it doesn't have is the centralization of APIs with the type safety. That's where TRPC kind of still makes sense for SvelteKit. A lot of people don't use it for SvelteKit because you can get around it and still maintain type safety. Yeah, it's just like a preference thing. Okay, next one here is Prisma. So what is Prisma? an ORM. It's an object relational mapping tool for Node.js and TypeScript again. Essentially allows you to easily integrate with any database and have them be extremely type safe and easy to query from your backend or your front end.
Devs, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less on Studio. Integrate, extend, and write custom scripts in a VS Code-based IDE. Leverage zero setup dev, test, and production environments. Ship faster with an AI code assistant. And work with Wix headless APIs on any tech stack. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. Link in the show description and in the show notes.
So it provides you kind of a middle layer between your database and your backend/front end. Makes it super easy to write like a database schema in JSON, for example. So your schema just looks like a regular JavaScript object and allows you to kind of query your database. Instead of using traditional SQL, you use Prisma's proprietary kind of querying functions. From a very layman perspective, you're essentially just like querying a database, but using JavaScript. I don't know if that makes sense. You're not at all needing to interact with SQL syntax. It is a proprietary JavaScript function library, but it's a fairly easy one to understand. Once you query once or twice, you'll kind of pick it up. And specifically for JavaScript developers that have never touched a database, I feel like it's a safer route to go because it kind of protects you from a lot of gotchas that SQL could have. And it's easier for you to spin up in terms of like learning. Instead of learning SQL, you're just learning another JavaScript library. That's how I kind of consider it. A little bit easier to pick up. Having said that, there are a few caveats that like Prisma, there's a few things that it doesn't do as well as SQL with joins. They're fixing that, and it's already gotten better since I started using it. So that's why I still very much prefer it and really like it. And the other thing is that it's so far away from SQL that it's not a great resource to learn SQL, if that makes sense. So a lot of times developers, like the knock on Prisma will be like, well, if you're going to be a Prisma dev or use Prisma, you're not going to be able to translate a lot of those skills to SQL. Whereas if you use other ORMs like Drizzle or Keasley or whatever, there's other options other than Prisma. They're more similar to SQL. So for developers that already know SQL, there's probably better options. Prisma, I think, is more for, I need to get stuff set up quickly. I need to build a full stack application. I don't have time to learn SQL. I'm just going to use something that I already know. So that's why I prefer it. I don't have time to learn SQL. If I have to write an advanced SQL query, which I sometimes do, I'll use ChatGPT and then just do a bunch of testing. And I'm okay with that because Prisma can handle the rest. Next thing here, this is a big one. We had the founder on our show, Supermaven. We've talked about this. We'll link the episode in these show notes. And we also actually have a affiliate code for Supermaven. This episode obviously isn't sponsored by them, but we will provide an affiliate code for everyone to get a little bit of money off. I can't remember exactly the percentage off. We haven't used it yet. But we'll have all that detail inside the episode's show notes. So go check that out. But Supermaven is an AI-powered autocomplete tool similar to Copilot. So GitHub Copilot, Supermaven, they both do similar things. The reason that I prefer Supermaven to Copilot is, first of all, it has a free tier, which is awesome. Second of all, it also is just faster. So there's this thing called AI or Copilot Brain, where what you'll do is you'll start writing something and then you'll wait for Copilot to finish it for you. And it's a very noticeable wait where you have to wait several seconds sometimes, or 5 to 10 seconds. Whereas with Supermaven, you're writing and it kind of starts to autocomplete as you're writing. It's a lot quicker than Copilot. I like that because it removes that waiting time for me. I think the Primogen was the one that mentioned it, where he used Copilot so much that when he turned it off, he had a noticeable delay in his typing, because every time he would start typing, he would just stop for 10 seconds and then realize that, oh, he's waiting for Copilot, which is it screwed with his brain. So that is a real thing. I did it myself too. I turned it off Copilot and then I tried to type code, and I can still type, I still know what I'm typing, and I still, I can still autocomplete using TypeScript, but I did have a random wait here and there where I was trying to kind of like waiting for an AI to complete something when it wasn't going to complete anything. And that threw me off a little bit. So Supermaven helps with that. The other thing Supermaven does is it does a much better job at keeping your code in context windows. So it understands almost your entire code base at times. I think it has a 300,000 character context window or something like that, which is super helpful because if you're writing something in one file and then going to another file, especially when I'm talking about this front end, back end stuff, it will keep it in context and know what I'm referring to from file to file. So that autocomplete capability is pretty sweet. It's also able to edit multiple lines at the same time now, which is kind of a newer feature, I think. I don't know. It doesn't get in my way. I feel like a lot of AI tools, Copilot in general, the one that I've used the most, kind of feels like it gets in my way sometimes. It like jumps my code around, stuff like that. Whereas Supermaven, if I'm trying to write code without it, I can do it. But if I need a little bit of help, it's kind of easy to pop up the chat window, or I can rely on its autocomplete pretty easily without having to do that wait period.
I did want to mention one other thing as well, is that on htmlthethings.com, we also have a companion article regarding Supermaven, where contributing author Michael LaRocca actually, talked about literally Supermaven, about Jacob Jackson, which is the founder, but then also touched on the podcast topics, but then there's actually a review. So he went in, used it, he installed it. He had some thoughts about it. He actually had some questions that he sent over to the founder, which he graciously answered. And so there's a whole bunch of cool insights and stuff like that in there. If you want to give that a read, the link to that will be in the show notes as well.
Awesome. Next thing here, Vercel. I mentioned it earlier in the episode, but Vercel is a cloud platform that essentially handles all of your deployments, and especially with meta frameworks like Next.js, SvelteKit, Nuxt, and stuff like that. It handles your entire deployment pipeline. So what does that mean? When you essentially need to get your code live, instead of having to go in and open up a server and transfer your files onto that server and wait for that to update and then go to that and go to the URL, what you're doing is you're committing to GitHub or any other Git service. And based on the commit that you do, it will build a deployment. And so it takes away that entire aspect of managing servers, which is pretty big if you're a small startup. And it also provides you with stuff like preview deployments so that you can preview a deployment before it goes into production, how it's going to, act live. That all happens also through Git commits. You can enable them on every Git commit. You can kind of take it down and only do it on certain Git commits to save some deployment time and stuff like that. So there's just a lot of flexibility with it. The costs are relatively high in terms of user seat counts. And a lot of these web app tools or web SaaS tools for web development make their money on teams. And it makes sense. Like when you're a single developer, a lot of these tools are either free or very low cost when you're just one person team. As soon as you go to more people, it usually charges you per seat. And that's what Vercel does. It has certain costs on actual traffic, but for the most part, unless your app is huge, you can get around that, or you can, they don't come up. But where it really gets you is the per seat cost, honestly. I think it's like $20 per seat. So if you have right now, I think we have 8 developers, you can do the math. It can become pretty expensive pretty quickly. So that's the unfortunate thing about Vercel, is that the scaling scales with the amount of people you have on your team. But again, the amount of time it saves you is where the balance comes in. We currently don't have a dev on the project I'm working on, the team of 8 developers. We don't have a developer, a sysadmin, essentially. We don't have a server admin. And in my opinion, to manage the application that we have, we'd need one. If we were to go on something like an AWS or a VPS or whatever, like a dedicated server, anything that's a little bit out of the scope of Vercel, we would need a sysadmin. We would need someone that would manage all of what Vercel does. So, you'd factor in the cost of a person, it becomes a lot more sustainable. And the fact that they are, you can contact them for support and they can handle like support tickets, and they handle a bunch of other security stuff and CDN stuff. And they integrate directly with the framework that we're using, which is SvelteKit, to make it even faster for caching purposes and stuff like that. Like there's just a lot to give up when going from a hosted, managed CI, continuous integration pipeline service and hosting service like Vercel to creating all that yourself. Not that it's out of the question. And like currently, even right now, as we speak, we do have some internal discussions about like, hey, let's make sure that we can at least migrate away from Vercel because we don't want to be reliant on it. I think it's really important to be able to pick up and go wherever you want, whenever you want, because who knows what's going to happen tomorrow. Vercel is a VC funded company. Whenever I hear VC funding, I immediately think, oh no, I need to make sure I can get away from this if I need to, because tomorrow they could be like, well, instead of $20 a person, it's $1,000 a person. And that's an exaggeration. They haven't said that. They're probably not going to do that. But I'm just saying it's up to them and their investors. And that can happen. And then we'd be, out on the street. So you need to make sure that you can escape from these services, but to use them while you're scaling is perfectly okay. And Vercel provides a really good developer experience.
And I mean, we've mentioned this before on the show, is the DevOps side of things, the sysadmin side of things. I mean, that's a career in and of itself. You can go to school just for that type of stuff. And so I know that like, obviously web development touches that stuff because websites run on servers and, developers are going to be familiar to some extent with hosting and those type of things, sysadmin duties, but it would be, quite a task or quite an ask, I guess I should say, to ask somebody to say, hey man, can you run like all of our servers, all of our hosting, do all of our development, have insight into all of this. I mean, just organizationally speaking, it's going to be a heck of a lot of things. Task switching is going to be a heck of an ask. And that's just a heck of a lot of things to know. And it's going to become one of those things where it's like, jack of all trades, masters of none. And it's going to be, you're going to be stretched pretty thin. Like, I mean, I know a lot of server stuff, but I haven't done, a lot of the server stuff that I used to do like way back in the day. Like I used to just do server stuff. It was just for sysadmin. It wasn't for DevOps. But it was just being a sysadmin running a lab, that type of thing way back in the day. But I know that stuff, but I don't really remember that stuff because like the stuff that's in the forefront of my brain right now is a lot of it is development stuff, of course, right? So having somebody, be everything is going to be a lot. And so, Vercel sort of offloads some of that, as it sounds like. A lot of, different hosting things. We've had tons of episodes and we have lots of articles on htmlallthethings.com about hosting. A lot of hosting providers do provide services to help you offload those things. And so, it's great in that way because unfortunately, it's just not possible to, especially if you need it, to have someone just run everything for you. There's a reason why, and I'll kind of use this, I guess, as a transition. There's a reason why people go to things like Wix Studio, Webflow, those type of things, is because a lot of the sysadmin, a lot of the install of software, this and that, comes down to the company that, Wix has to deal with it. Webflow has to deal with it. They have to deal with it themselves rather than you going in or you hiring someone to deal with that. And then you go in and build your own stuff with your own customizations and that type of thing. And you are effectively using their software to build the web app that you're desiring to build. And that's actually the next sort of thing that I wanted to talk about here, which is I've been using Webflow a heck of a lot recently, but like the number one thing that I like about something like Webflow is that it is a no-code visual design tool. And what it allows us to do is it allows us to collaborate. It allows like developers to come in with custom code, but you don't have to use custom code for a lot of things. The big thing here, though, is, and this is not just unique to Webflow, it's on Wix Studio as well. It's on multiple other services as well. Elementor actually is a prime example where when it's connected to, when it's installed in WordPress, is what I like being able to go in and realistically use my sort of developer knowledge. And I understand sort of how people are going to want to interact with their CMS. And I know, okay, I don't want to allow the user to make a mistake here. So for example, something as simple as categories on a blog post. It's like, I'm going to create a database of categories. I'm going to allow them to add categories, but I'm going to force them to write, just plain text. Let's say, for example, I'm going to force them to write plain text. I'm going to force them to have a color associated with each category. And then when they select a category on the blog post, they're going to select from that list that they've made and that I've contributed to. I don't want them to make a mistake where it's just an open text field where they have to type in the same category. And, one person writes web design, another person writes web designer, another person writes web design with a dash, it's a big mess, right? And so what I'm effectively getting at is a lot of these developer tools, these no-code tools, I really like the ones that have the customizability that allow me to allow my websites to really have dynamic content, have dynamic data. I'm able to use a visual builder and actually show people that are non-technical oftentimes on a phone call. I can literally go into a Zoom call, share my screen and say, take a look at this. This is what I'm building. I want to have, a drop down here. I want to like hard limit you guys. I want to make this like as close to a zero error scenario as possible. And that's honestly, I know it's a weird thing to sort of like, kind of zoom in on, but this reduces the amount of phone calls that I receive so much. And the amount of phone calls that I do receive is usually something silly like, hey, I don't know what link to put here, or like the person puts the wrong link in. Well, they may call me for that, but at the end of the day, it's like, well, man, just like put whatever link in there that you think is needed, more or less, right? That type of thing. So like these tools are becoming more and more powerful. A lot of these tools used to, and there are still a lot of them out there where they're very sort of template based and you sort of more or less have to use their set of materials. So let's say you like drag in a call to action or you drag in a contact form and they give you a set of tools to customize it, but it's, kind of rigid. Those are great for websites that you're trying to spin up fast, but things like Webflow, things like Wix Studio, those things, and Plasmic as well, actually, those things like really, really let you dive in. And so what it's doing is it's a no-code tool that really empowers the developers and it allows the designers to make some of those more complex changes as well here and there. And so that type, I don't even know what you really want to call it, but that like sort of type of no-code tool, of that web design tool is, I think, really, really cool. Are there limitations? 100%. Are there weird limitations? 100%, right? There's not every single scenario is going to be covered. And if you're using software that is meant for the masses, it's generic. Of course, it has to be, because not everyone's making, a car lot website. Not everyone's making like a computer building website, right? So they have to make generic set of tools. So there's always going to be limitations, because that's the thing I always hear from developers is that they don't like the limitations. But here's the thing, having it be realistically a big set of Lego and I get to put it together. I get to choose the CMS fields. I get to choose, what to build. With Elementor, for example, I drag in their widgets. With some code, I can make my own widgets. And now the person, like the designer, let's say, goes into the visual builder and they can actually drag my widget in there. There's tons of plugins for Elementor, as an example. There's tons of plugins for a lot of these tools. There's lots of integrations for a lot of these tools, like MailChimp will work on things, for example, because marketing teams will use that. And so this sort of newfangled, way of designing with these no-code tools, I think it's just fantastic myself. Is for agencies, it's great because like Mike and I run an agency. It allows us to spin up things fast. It allows us to not worry when we push out an update that things are going to crash. Like I think I've had like 3 crashes on Webflow, like where like my changes have actually caused the page to crash, and it's been an isolated crash. It's been just a crash of the one page. Whereas with something like a WordPress, which is a little more involved, although it's getting better, but a little more involved, is I've pushed out updates and the whole site crashes, right? Even when I'm only trying to affect one page. And so this is sort of my thing that I wanted to bring up, is that these visual builders that just really kind of give you like more control. It's less about bringing the consumer in. So I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. So just recently, and I was only playing consultant in this case, we had someone who had been running a small business for years and years, and they've never been online. They've just gone to festivals and sold in person and this type of thing, and they wanted to go online. And I said, okay, like what's your experience with selling online? They really didn't have much. And I said, what about with, technology in general? And they gave me, they have, some great basic computer skills. I said, perfect. This is what we're going to do for you. We're going to go to Shopify. We're going to give you the starter plan. The starter plan is extremely locked down. I'm going to play consultant. You're going to go in there. You're going to dive in. You're going to try to make as many changes as you can. You're going to choose your shipping rates. You're going to choose your inventory. You're going to upload your pictures. You're going to change your fonts. You're going to do the very few little things you're allowed to do on the starter plan. And I'm going to just sit by, and you're going to let me know whenever you need me to come in and help. And that's what happened. Here and there. Hey, I don't know how to do this. Can you do this? Hey, I set it to this. I don't know if that's right. Can you check it? It was great. The store is launched now, right? That is not one of these no-code tools, right? The starter plan does not give you the Shopify Webflow build or the Shopify website builder. It doesn't give you that. It gives you just like the basics, and Shopify is doing everything for you. It's processing the orders and you are fulfilling what's inside of the software, right? Those pieces of software are great in that type of context, right? That person's goal is not to have this amazing website that's going to blow everyone away. This person's goal is to sell their product and learn how to sell things online. So it's great to have something that's already pre-built and already ready to go and just has a little bit of customization. But when that person is ready for the next step, they can upgrade their Shopify plan. And then I get access to the Shopify web builder. And then I'm going to be able to go in and change how the footer works, put in a slider, do this, do that, go here, go there, make all these changes. And so it's great that these tools, a lot of them now, even have tiers. Like even if you were to go into Webflow, you can download a template. Go into WordPress, download a template, right? Wix has templates. Like there's a ton of different ways to actually go in and, use these things. And so, I don't know, the openness, the sort of like laying your Lego blocks out on the floor, if you will, way of doing it, to me is just one of the better ways to build websites these days. And it requires very, very minimal code.
I 100% agree. And I think the other part of this is that it can be used in tandem with a custom solution. That's the important part to realize. For instance, at our current job right now, we are doing Webflow for marketing materials, and we are doing custom, SvelteKit application for the actual apps. And what it allows us to do is, you have to manage the design system. You have to make sure the design system matches between your app and your Webflow site. But a separate person or a separate team can build out the marketing stuff versus your app stuff. And what the marketing team is able to do then, or the design team or whoever, is manage all of the marketing material without having to put in developer requests, which is huge. If anyone has worked on a team where they have built a custom marketing web page while maintaining a fully functional web application on top of that, you know that these, marketing requests are usually put on the back burner because you're, putting out fires on the app or you're building a feature on the app or whatever. And what ends up happening is that like the copy gets stale, the site looks, older, everything just doesn't update as quickly. And for marketing, that's a pain. Like they can't create the landing pages that they need to create as quickly as they need to create them. They're not able to test out different things. They're not able to try to drive traffic in different ways. And so you have this disconnect, and usually marketing at that point will start blaming development for its inability to innovate and its inability to create better material. And the developers will start pointing back and be like, well, we're working hard on the application. We don't have time for that. Anyway, it turns into this toxic mess. So separating those out in an application does so much for relieving the stress from both sides, and using an established tool like Webflow or Wix Studio, whatever, it's going to make for a better experience. Just believe me. And, don't make them too complicated. Sometimes people try to, put in too much complexity into the no-code platform, and an inevitability when it's not a developer that's actually like requesting the features. I think it's important to kind of push back here or there and be like, hey, this is a no-code tool. This is a marketing page. If we want to do this, maybe we build it on the custom side of things or something like that, just to kind of not overextend something that should not be overextended, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a great way to separate things. Like right now, like you and I are working for a client in which you're working on the app and I'm helping out with the marketing team, straight up. And we're using different tools. Like that's a great way just to handle it. Like it's a great way to, like, I'm still using a little bit of my, coding knowledge. I'm using my, my builder knowledge. I'm still using my like knowledge is basically what I'm getting at. Like, I'm not just, I haven't become just like install template, press publish. Okay, great. I'm still using this knowledge. What's happening is the marketing team themselves are able to go in with either with tools that I've set up or with the tools that exist already. And they're able to go in and like change the blog post, do this, make that, make some font changes, whatever. If they get themselves into trouble, all they got to do is either roll back or call me, and then I was like, okay, I'll log in tomorrow. I'll fix that for you. Don't worry, or whatever. Or like, hey, what I'm doing right now is I'm basically building them all the baseline stuff. So like, hey, build out this new thing for us. And then, we'll take it over. And if we need any help, we'll let you know. And it's like, okay, fantastic. So build it out. And that exact sort of workflow happens.
That's exactly it. Just to end this off, I'm going to do an honorable mention. So the honorable mention here I'm going to do is Beekeeper. It's a database management application. It's kind of like a GUI app that allows you to connect to many, many different databases from every different provider you can have. and it has like an SQL query builder that helps you query, like write queries with autocomplete and stuff like that, and then manage all your connections of a database. When you're managing a bunch of different databases, I feel like something like this is a must, because what ends up happening is that you're either connecting with like a PuTTY or like a terminal to each database, and then it becomes a mess figuring out what database you can connect to. What I like to do right now is like, I'll put in, for instance, for any production database, I'll make sure that I have the read-only version, and that this app allows you to like literally toggle read-only. And then every time I just need to do a quick query to read something, I know that even if I write, drop table, it will not let me do that. And so it makes it easier for me to connect safely to production databases. I like that personally because I'm always afraid of writing SQL. I don't know. I'm not very good at it yet. And I'm just always afraid to accidentally overload the server or drop the table or write something that I shouldn't write. And then if I ever do need to write something in a custom SQL query, I can always create another one that's write only or has the right privileges, and I usually delete those. So that's just like a little feature that I really enjoyed with this kind of Beekeeper application. I've just started using it over the last couple months, so that's why it's not like in my tech I love yet, because I still haven't kind of fully integrated it into my workflow. But it's something that I am kind of continuing to use on a week-to-week basis to save me from myself, essentially. And the final thing here, we were going to talk about hardware, and we did mention it at the start of the episode, but Matt brought up a really good point that we have a whole episode where we kind of dive into our hardware. And I just took a look. Nothing has really changed from that episode for me. So what we're going to do is, instead of boring you with the same thing, we're going to add a link to that episode to this one, so you can go in and take a listen to what hardware Matt and I are using in our day-to-day and web development. And yeah, if we ever update our hardware, we'll probably do something on that. But it was a good point, Matt. I didn't think about that, and makes this episode a little bit more concise and more focused on the actual web development tech.
Yeah, I didn't when I mentioned it, I didn't mean to cut it off, but it does make sense. It's we have talked about that before. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to us on socials. I run the Meta stuff. So Threads and Instagram, and Mike, you run the X account. So if you're curious, hey, what do you think about, I'm thinking about getting a laptop or whatever. I'm not going to give everyone advice on what laptop to buy, because I already do that for my family, and that's enough. But but if you want to talk shop and be yo, what do you think about this? And blah blah blah. I'm down to talk shop to an extent about that type of stuff. So that'd be cool. All right. Well, I think we did it. I think that's the episode. Unless you have anything else to add, Mike, I think we're gonna run the old conclusion.
Runner up.
Well, before we do that, remember that we are on Patreon. If you want to support the show, that is patreon.com/HTML. All the things, and many thanks to our $3 tier patrons: Tim from the Web Hacker on the webhacker.com, Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com, Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com, Joshua via silvio.us, and Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se. And just a reminder, if you have signed up for this tier, I have reached out to you on the actual Patreon messaging system, itself. So if you're hey, why isn't Matt talk to me about getting on the end of the show? I have sent out a message there. Hopefully you have received it. And last but not least, we'd like to give a shout out to Michael LaRocca, a contributing author on HTMLallthethings.com. Michael is the author of Self-Taught, the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. Feel free to leave a comment or a review in the platform that you are listening to this on. And this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media. On Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.